Okay, hi guys, welcome back. I'm Law of Attraction. I'm here to tell you all about trauma bonding and why they happen, what they look like and how we can get out of them. So I'm going to give you a nice little demonstration here. We have mum and dad over here of George and mum and dad and mum over here of Georgia. Now, George and Georgia are in a relationship together. They have decided to become one and to find love together. Now, the relationship between George and Georgia is a problematic one, something that we are going to call a trauma bond. And what is caused by this? How is it caused? How do we get to this state? So let's have a little look at this with our beautiful diagram here. So first of all, we have mum over here of George, and mum over here of George, she is a nice lady, but she has an attachment issue. So she is an anxious attachment, okay? So we're going to put up here anxious attachment for George's mum. You could probably do this with a text, might make it a little bit better. And dad over here, dad is an avoidant attachment style. Okay, now an anxious attachment and an avoidant attachment style means that dad avoids confrontation, he avoids connection as a result of anxiety, and mum is anxious over it. So she worries about being abandoned, she's fearful of dad going out the house, she's fearful of not being loved. And whatever, you know, we can sit and we can say that our parents have created situations for us, but the truth of the matter is that we're all victims of victims, okay? So the reason why George's parents are like this is probably because their parents were like that and it's created this scenario for them, okay? So George over here has a parent who's quite anxious, slightly neurotic, slightly worried, and has a problematic relationship with his father. His father is an avoidant type, so he runs from conflict. When he sees that mum is getting, worried and concerned and upset, he actually probably would prefer to avoid the situation. Now, the problem with this is it has led George to have certain personality traits. So this is kind of where people would, if this continues and it's very extreme, this is where people could go into having a personality disorder. And this personality tends to come out in certain ways. Now, for George, having a mum who's got an anxious attachment style and a dad who has an avoidant attachment style, it has also made him somebody that's rather anxious, but also empathetic. He empathizes a lot with his mum. He worries about her. He has almost kind of stepped in at points to be a husband role to his mother. Okay, so he empathizes a lot, he's worried, he stepped in to be the husband role to the mum, which has unfortunately left him with a problematic relationship with his father. So his relationship with his father is volatile, and often you'll see that George ignores his own boundaries, okay, to attempt to create peace and love and happiness within the family, okay? So George has got his own attachment issues. He's very empathic. He worries quite a lot. He stepped in to be a husband role to his mother. The relationship with his father is volatile. And so as a result, George not only ignores his boundaries with the relationship with his father, he also ignores the boundaries that he has with the relationship with his mum. As you can see there, he's overstepping his boundaries to become an enmeshed, a relationship with his mum that's kind of unhealthy, where these two can become codependent. So codependency is where two people are not capable of supporting themselves, and so what they tend to do is create kind of like a codependent kind of relationship between the two. So George's relationships with his parents are very difficult. He has a codependent relationship with his mother, and he has a role that's rather strenuous with his father that can sometimes come in a as a controversial, okay, it can sometimes be kind of a controversial relationship with his dad. That's enough of that line. How do you stop? So it can sometimes be one where he's ignoring his own boundaries. It could be that he's stepping in to play a father husband role to his own mother, and also kind of having very difficult relationship there with his dad. Okay, so this is George in a bit of a nutshell. George has met Georgia, okay? Georgia over here, lovely lady. This can work in, non-heteronormative relationships or relationships with absentee fathers or whatever, mothers, whatever it is. They basically tend to come out the same in some way, shape or form. So we've got the same kind of scenario over here, okay? However, we have a relationship where perhaps Georgia's dad is absent. And an absentee father doesn't necessarily mean that, that he's not there at all. It could be that he works a lot, that he hasn't got much time for the daughter. It could be that mum takes a more motherly role. And so, whatever. It doesn't mean that he has to not be present in the home. But some form of absenteeism tends to create these issues. So mum is overprotective because that's her role. We could have some issues with mum from mental health issues. Maybe mum has some unhealed trauma there. Perhaps she was abused as a child. I don't know, anything that's led to her kind of overprotectivity. So here we go. George has come over here. George, in effect, has got mum issues and dad issues, okay? Georgia over here has also got mum issues and dad issues of some response. Now, George has become very used to empathizing, to worrying about other people, to stepping in to be strong figurehead roles, and to calming volatile scenarios, okay? What has Georgia possibly become used to? Well, let's have a think about this. So Georgia's mum is overprotective, which has led her to feeling stifled. And she feels that she is unworthy of love because her father didn't love her. She also, because of the way that mum has been overprotective, she relates control to love. And she can get very, anxious by any perceived abandonment, okay? Okay, because that triggers, that triggers in her the same feelings that she's had from her dad. Okay, so that makes sense. Hopefully this makes sense. So Georgia feels stifled by mum. She's kind of put herself out there a little bit more than what she needs to, possibly. She feels unworthy of love because dad didn't love her. And she also looks at control being a faction of love, okay, because of the relationship she's had with her mum. Because dad was absenteeist, she also gets very anxious by perceived abandonment. So George and Georgia now have somehow, unfortunately, fallen in love and into a relationship. And the problem with relationships like this is that George and Georgia will be triggering off each other's wounds. So the behaviours that trigger George is the behaviours that Georgia displays, and vice versa. So the behaviours that Georgia naturally displays, feelings of unworthy of love, is anxious by perceived abandonment. This triggers off unhealed trauma that George has from his parents. So because he has unhealed trauma, what George will do, he will start to re-display all of the behaviours that he used to do with mum, okay? So he will then step in, he'll start playing that husband role for Georgia. He will ignore his own boundaries, he will ignore some volatility, and he will empathize and worry a lot because that's what he's used to doing. For Georgia, she may become quite volatile at points because she may perceive abandonment from George and she gets angry with him. She may feel that sometimes when he steps in and tries to do too much, she might feel stifled in the same way that her mum was overprotective to her. So you can start to see that these two people end up getting triggered by each other's own childhood issues, and this creates a cycle. When you have two people with unhealed childhood trauma, they tend to not be able to recognize any red flags or issues. They may have seen some red flags, but the red flags become ignored, okay? This is because they haven't got the correct boundaries that they would have had or should have had from the previous relationships with their parents, okay? Love bombing, honeymoon period, red flags are often ignored. As a result of this, abuse begins to happen. And trauma bonding, in effect, is kind of a form of Stockholm syndrome. It's where that we begin to justify or defend abuse. So the red flags are ignored, we justify the abuse, and this is often done empathically. So it's often like, you know, this person has had a bad life, you know, that something's happened to them. Somebody's upset, that, you know, whatever it is. So we find that George will start to cover for Georgia, and Georgia will start to cover for George. You will find that they will not tell people about what's going on, and if somebody tries to intervene, they may become kind of, you know, worried about this. So what happens as a result of trauma bonding is, because we're not being honest about what's happening in the relationship, we're ignoring the abuse and we're ignoring the red flags, we start to tell a different story to people outside of the relationship. You know, story to friends and family about the relationship. So this is why this stuff can continue for so long, because nobody knows it's happening. And if a friend or family member sees a little bit of it, you know, often it's kind of like, oh, it must have just been a once off because Georgia says that Georgia's amazing. George says that Georgia is amazing. Yeah. So this is where the problem lies. When you are in a relationship where each of you is hiding stuff from your parents and you're hiding things from your friends, and you have these you know, triggers and tendencies as a result of your own unhealed trauma and vice versa, what happens is the only people that can comfort these two people as a result of the trauma is each other. Okay? So this tends to happen in very kind of difficult situations where one person exploits the other person and the other person exploits the other person in some way, shape or form, creating this codependency between the two of you. And because nobody else knows what's going on outside of the relationship, the only people that you can go to for comfort about the terrifying and problematic issues in the relationship is each other. And this leads to comments such as, you know, she's under a lot of pressure, it's okay, you know, she'll change later, you know, I can't leave him, he's the love of my life, you know, it's not their fault, it's my fault, I do something wrong. And you can see that how these how these behaviors of being a childhood has caused those ideas, you know, that there's something that the child could do, that they're worried, that they're empathizing, that you know, how if only we can stop the issues with mum and dad. You can see how that those behaviors and those thought patterns in childhood can lead into us justifying bad behaviors within a trauma bond. And even more so and even more problematic is that if you've been traumatized, if you've been abused and you have these issues in childhood, then you're so much more likely to accept abuse in adulthood because it feels normal. Okay, and so this continues the cycle even more. Abuse feels normal to abused people. Okay, and often what happens is that by the time we get into adult relationships, if we've had traumatic childhoods, is that we're already addicted to the, you know, to the cycle of abuse and the chemicals that come as a result of that. Okay, we become chemically, you know, addicted to our own, you know, hormones, as it were. Okay. So, trauma bonding is a very difficult thing to get out of, and it often kind of follows this kind of pattern of you know, rage and regret, rage and regret, rage and regret. And after causing harm, an abusive person often will promise to change. They promise to do things different. You can sit down, have very rational conversations with these people about what's went wrong and why we need to change it. However, the problem is that these cycles are going on unconsciously. And so until these things are made conscious and the psychological work is done, these people are never going to be able to rectify these unconscious cycles that are happening. Okay, and we can often fall back into these feelings of empathy and love, and oh, maybe I can fix them, and all this other bullshit that we tell ourselves. So the most important thing to recognize is if you're in a trauma bonded relationship or in an unhealthy relationship, the kindest thing that you can do is to leave. Okay, the kindest thing that we can do is to completely cut ourselves out of the relationships and recognize that nothing good is going to come from this relationship. Okay, it's a trauma bonded relationship. Everything in this relationship is coming from a point of abuse and unconscious awareness to our own addictions and trauma cycles, and that we cannot fix that with somebody else who is also traumatized, abused, and addicted to their own trauma cycles. And an act of love is to separate ourselves from that enmeshment, from that codependency, and from that abusive relationship, so we can actually catalyze healing in ourselves and healing in the other person. This is one of the hardest things to do, but when you recognize that it is being done for the best of both, it becomes an easier situation. If you want more advice on how to actually get out of a trauma bond, any more information about what an avoidant attachment style is or an anxious attachment style, if you've got any questions, leave them below. I'll do my best to answer them. I have gotten myself out of trauma bonded relationships many a time, despite all of my subconscious patterning from my childhood that I have now rectified, and I'm now in a healthy relationship. So if you need any advice or information, please make sure you click subscribe, click the wiggly bell, because that will mean that you get notifications when I post something new. I do one-to-one coaching, group coaching coming up in 2023, and if you need any help, just message, okay? I'm here to help you. I'll speak to you all soon. Take care of yourselves, and remember, boundaries protect you from unhealthy behaviors. I love you. Goodbye. Now, the cycle, let's have a little look at the cycle. Can I go down? I'd like some more space. No. Okay. This is where you realize that you should have learned how to do draw beforehand. I'll just edit this all out. Okay.